It wasn't supposed to be something serious. It was just for thrill, but now it's one of my biggest regrets. People have read it, and I know I messed up big time. It kills me, but I don't know what else to do. My husband, age 45, and I, age 40, have been married for 7 years. We have a son, age 5. We met when one of our mutual friends set us up. Initially, we weren't looking for anything serious, just having fun. However, we formed a connection and got together exclusively. After dating for 2 years, we got married. My husband is a software engineer at Google, and I work in the sales department of an insurance company. Our family life was going well. We had everything until I messed it all up. It all started 5 months ago when my husband got a promotion at work. He had to work extra hours, and whenever he came back home, he was always tired. We stopped being intimate, and every time I tried to initiate something, he would just shrug it off, citing fatigue or some other excuse. His behavior was irritating, and to not be affected by it, I started focusing on work. There was a client, Jay, a 48-year-old with a small fintech company. His company signing up for our corporate health insurance would be a significant deal for us. My promotion depended on securing him as a client. My boss emphasized leaving no stone unturned, and I was told to be friendly rather than strictly professional to gain his trust. I did what I was told and stopped being overly professional and rigid with Jay. I was responsible for getting in contact with him and explaining everything he needed to know. The insurance market was tough, and we needed all the clients we could get. During my interactions with Jay, I started to blur the lines between professional and friendly, as my boss had suggested. My frustration with my husband's behavior persisted, and one day, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I asked him directly about what was going on, whether he was no longer attracted to me, or if there was someone else. He assured me it was just work stress, and I believed him. Unfortunately, the lack of intimacy in our relationship continued, and I began putting all my focus on work. With our son away at summer camp, I didn't feel like going home after work. Our alone time, which used to be filled with passion and intimacy, became lonely. Meetings with Jay progressed, and we discussed corporate health insurance over meals. Despite my attempts to maintain a balance between professional and friendly, I failed. Jay, a funny and good-looking man, occasionally made comments that seemed like flirting. I knew he was single, but I brushed it off, thinking he was just being friendly, and I might be misinterpreting his intentions. One day, over lunch, understandably, you're grappling with a complex and emotionally charged situation. Here's a detailed account of your experience, based on your recount. The incident that escalated everything happened quite unexpectedly. One day, while having lunch with Jay, I accidentally spilled water on my top. As I tried to address the mishap, I couldn't help but notice Jay's eyes lingering on my cleavage. I quickly redirected the conversation back to work-related topics, and he shifted his gaze to my face. Despite knowing it was wrong, I couldn't deny the thrill I felt from his attention. It was a stark contrast to the lack of interest I was experiencing at home from my husband. At this point in my marriage, I was deeply frustrated. My husband's constant rejections had not only hurt me, but had also taken a toll on my self-esteem. Jay, on the other hand, offered a kind of solace. He had become more than a client. He was someone I considered a friend. Our meetings gradually became less about work and more personal. We started going out for meals that had nothing to do with business. I was aware of my growing attraction to him, and part of me welcomed this distraction from the increasingly awkward situation at home. The dynamic in our household had changed drastically. My husband spent most of his time in his office, and by the time he got home, I usually had finished my dinner. Our home felt like a hotel to him. Since I had stopped initiating any romantic advances, he didn't either. It was clear he wasn't going to make any moves in the foreseeable future. I knew it was wrong, but my self-control was waning. During one of our lunches, I found myself making a bold move. I started rubbing my foot against Jay's legs under the table. The interest in his eyes was unmistakable. Overwhelmed by the prolonged neglect from my husband, I gave in to the moment. That night, I did something I never imagined I would do. I went to Jay's home and slept with him. The frustration and loneliness I had been feeling seemed to culminate in that decision. I left his house in the middle of the night while he was still asleep, not knowing what to say or do next. As I got into my car, I noticed 2 missed calls from my husband. I prayed he was asleep by the time I got home, not ready to face him. When I arrived, I found him fast asleep, oblivious to the turmoil I was in. The morning after that fateful night, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. When my husband asked about my whereabouts, I casually mentioned a work meeting that ran late. His lack of interest and casual acceptance of my explanation didn't alleviate my guilt, but his continued disinterest in me overshadowed any immediate consequences of my lie. Wrestling with my emotions, I made a firm decision. I wouldn't see Jay again. The contract with him was almost finalized, and I reassured myself that it was a one-time lapse in judgment. I had a husband and a son, and I couldn't afford to be reckless. Heading to the office, I attempted to block out the world. My husband's changed behavior weighed heavily on me, and he remained oblivious to the turmoil within our relationship. The whole week, I immersed myself in work, spending evenings at my desk since there was no one waiting for me at home anymore. My son was still away at summer camp, and my attempts to engage my husband in conversation were met with his preoccupation with various activities. As I focused on work, Jay surprisingly didn't reach out after our night together. While I had decided it was a one-time occurrence, the lack of any contact from him felt peculiar. Leaving the office on a Friday, I was taken aback to find Jay waiting for me outside. He approached me with a hug, expressing how much he missed me. Shock and surprise coursed through me. Trying to maintain distance, I reminded him that we couldn't repeat what happened. It was a mistake. His response caught me off guard. He looked hurt and countered that he didn't believe it was a mistake. "You cannot deny the attraction between us," were his exact words. In that moment, something within me shattered. The resolve that it was only a one-night thing began to crumble. I wanted to kiss him again, and the attraction between us, denied until now, resurfaced with undeniable force. My affair with Jay quickly escalated into a clandestine relationship marked by secrecy and excitement. The first time we became intimate in his car, it was a completely new experience for me, one filled with a thrill I had never known. The feeling of doing something so out of the ordinary was intoxicating, and despite knowing it was wrong, a part of me relished it. After that encounter, I drove home, showered, and went to bed, my husband returning home later without so much as a kiss. This lack of attention only fueled my decision to continue seeing Jay. Our affair was a mix of secrecy and spontaneity. Jay was aware of my marital status and my son, and he was surprisingly comfortable with the situation. We agreed to keep our relationship low-key, avoiding public places and masquerading our meetings as casual hangouts between colleagues. It was a delicate balance, but it worked, mostly because my husband seemed indifferent. His occasional remarks about my late returns were met with vague responses, which he accepted without question. It was a relief that he wasn't suspicious, but at the same time, it hurt that his lack of suspicion stemmed from disinterest rather than trust. Our rendezvous with Jay ranged from meeting at his home to spontaneous encounters after work. We found ourselves taking risks, getting intimate in cars, elevators, or any place where we felt hidden from prying eyes. This newfound thrill was exhilarating, a stark contrast to the routine and predictability of my marital life. Jay brought excitement and a sense of adventure that I craved, something I had hoped to find in my marriage, but never did. With Jay, every moment was unpredictable and thrilling, making me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. When my son returned from summer camp, I had to readjust to family life, which initially meant less time with Jay. However, I soon found ways to balance my time to continue the affair. Jay and I didn't have any long-term plans. We lived in the moment, taking each day as it came. His reassurance and presence provided a comfort I hadn't realized I was missing. On the other hand, my husband's preoccupation with work only grew, leaving me to handle all responsibilities at home. His promotion, while significant, only exacerbated the distance between us. Before, we had at least shared some time together on weekends or after dinner, but now, even those moments were gone. My relationship with Jay filled the void left by my husband's absence, numbing the pain of neglect and loneliness that had taken root in my marriage. As days passed, the contrasting attention I received from Jay, both inside and outside the bedroom, diminished the impact of my husband's indifference. It became increasingly evident that my husband's lack of concern for me was not a recent development. I had merely chosen to turn a blind eye. He hadn't made a single attempt to be intimate with me, further highlighting his disinterest. The idea of separating from him crossed my mind, but I pushed it aside for the sake of our son. Despite my husband's shortcomings as a spouse, he was a dedicated father, ensuring our son lacked nothing, including his undivided attention. While contemplating divorce, I grappled with the realization that I too had been a subpar wife. However, the thought of separating my son from his father proved too difficult to bear. Joint custody was dismissed because I couldn't fathom my son constantly shifting between two homes. Thus, I chose to endure the marriage for the sake of my child. My affection for my husband waned, leaving only my son as a beacon of joy in our shared household. For the first time in years, I found happiness, albeit compartmentalized into different aspects of my life. Work flourished, and my relationship with Jay was thriving. Despite the chaos at home, my husband remained engrossed in his work, seemingly oblivious to my presence or absence. Spending lunchtime with Jay allowed me to head home directly after work to be with my son. Jay, understanding my predicament, accommodated our meetings according to my convenience, displaying an unparalleled level of understanding. But, just when I believed everything was falling into place, an unforeseen twist changed the trajectory of my carefully constructed life. One day, as I was leaving for lunch with Jay, my phone tumbled down the stairs. While I considered fixing it later, the urgency of meeting Jay prevailed. He suggested heading to his home, and being a Friday, I could easily forgo the remainder of the workday. I arrived home around 6 p.m., the usual time I returned after work. However, my son was nowhere to be found. He was supposed to be at home. Instead, only Beth, our hired nanny, was present. Beth was responsible for looking after my son after school until either my husband or I returned home. The unexpected absence of my son added an unforeseen layer of complexity to the already intricate web of my life. The unexpected turn of events at the hospital had left me reeling with a mix of guilt and concern. Beth, our nanny, informed me that our son had developed a high fever at school, prompting his teacher to call me urgently. However, due to my damaged phone, their attempts to reach me had been in vain. It was my husband who had answered the call, promptly rushing to the hospital to be with our son. When I arrived, I found them sharing stories, my son looking significantly better. The doctor reassured us that it was just a flu, and our son was ready to go home. Taking our son in my car, I headed home, while my husband mentioned he needed to return to the office since he had hastily left work to be at the hospital. At home, I put our son to sleep after ensuring he was fed, mentally noting to fix my phone the next day. That night, I chose to sleep in my son's room, offering him the comfort he needed. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to find my husband standing by the door, staring at me. Initially startled, I soon realized it was just him, and relief flooded through me. He was still in his work clothes and explained that he had just returned, wanting to check on our son before going to bed. I nodded, and when he asked where I was when the teacher called, I told him about my broken phone, pointing to the shattered device on the nearby shelf. However, the doubt in his eyes lingered as he recounted calling my office and discovering that I had left for lunch and never returned. Fumbling for an explanation, I hastily mentioned a meeting that ran late, hoping he would believe it. Without revealing his thoughts, he went back to attend to our son. The following day, with my son on the mend, I decided to stay home, even though I needed to address my broken phone. During Beth's presence, I managed to get a new phone, a quicker solution than waiting for the repairs. My first call was to Jay, who, as always, proved understanding and supportive, assuring me that he was there for me. In the subsequent days, the routine returned to normal. My son recovered and resumed school, and I gradually resumed my office duties, meeting Jay during lunch breaks. However, one Friday, when I returned home, my husband awaited me, a sight that left me utterly shocked. His unexpected presence signaled a potential turning point, stirring a mixture of apprehension and uncertainty about what lay ahead. The unusual sight of my husband at home before me was a rarity, and I couldn't recall the last time it had happened. Attempting to maintain a facade of normalcy, I smiled at him and proceeded towards the shower. However, my plans were interrupted as he stopped me, inquiring about my whereabouts during my lunch break. A blank look crossed my face, and I wondered how he knew I had gone somewhere. He explained that he had visited my office, seeking my signature on some bank documents. My mind raced to the excuse I had used before, and I repeated it, hoping he'd buy it once again. To my relief, he seemed to believe me, nodding and allowing me to proceed. However, as he released me, he whispered that he trusted me. The weight of those words hit me with a wave of guilt that I couldn't contain. Despite my husband's shortcomings as a partner, he had faith in me, unaware of the affair I was carrying on behind his back. The shower became a silent sanctuary for my tears, a cascade of emotions and remorse. The realization of the trust bestowed upon me left me grappling with a difficult decision. I knew I couldn't continue down this path. Two options loomed ahead: either confess to my husband and bring an end to our marriage or sever ties with Jay. Both prospects brought tears, contemplating the loss of either relationship. Jay had been kind and understanding, but there was no future for us. The weight of my decisions became overwhelming, and I resolved to end things with Jay after the weekend. However, my resolution came too late. The following day, a Saturday, was intended for staying home with my son. Unaware of my husband's plans, he surprised me by not going to the office, opting to spend the day at home with us. The unexpected change in his routine triggered a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that something was wrong. Yet I dismissed it as paranoia, fueled by guilt and fear of getting caught. That day, my husband and I sat in the living room, the atmosphere tense with unspoken words. The weight of my secrets pressed upon me as we exchanged glances, and the realization dawned that I could no longer delay the inevitable, and a conversation that had been overdue for too long was about to unfold. The revelation of my affair with Jay unfolded in an unexpected confrontation with my husband. It happened when our son was away at the park with Beth, and my husband calmly declared his need for a conversation. The neutrality in his tone led me to believe he was unaware of my clandestine relationship, but I soon realized I was wrong. With calm composure, my husband disclosed his awareness of my affair. He explained how his suspicions had arisen when I started arriving home late, and those suspicions were confirmed during our son's hospitalization. My husband shared the evidence he had gathered, pictures of me and Jay, taken discreetly during my lunchtime meetings. The images depicted intimate moments, including us kissing, leaving me with no room for denial. Unable to deceive him any longer, I admitted to my transgressions. My husband, maintaining his stoic demeanor, inquired about how it all began. I recounted the story, explaining how his promotion had shifted his focus, leading to a void in our relationship that Jay had filled. Throughout my confession, my husband remained expressionless, absorbing the painful truth. When I mentioned my decision to end things with Jay on Monday, my husband dismissed it, laughing off my attempts at honesty. He asserted that there was no need to lie further, as he was already privy to my dirty little secret. Struggling with a mix of guilt and vulnerability, I insisted on my sincerity, emphasizing my intention to bring an end to the affair. However, my husband's trust had been shattered. He explained that he had been working tirelessly, aiming to provide the life we desired. He divulged plans for an upcoming international trip, an effort to create cherished memories for our family. In a harsh tone, he confronted me about my betrayal, highlighting his commitment and dedication to our family. His words pierced through me, and the weight of my actions finally struck, prompting tears of remorse. The realization that I had jeopardized a once-loving relationship with someone who had worked hard for our well-being intensified my anguish. As my tears flowed uncontrollably, my husband continued to address the painful truth of my affair. He revealed that he had contemplated confronting me the day before, but opted to give me a chance to confess voluntarily. His initial display of trust had been a test that I had failed miserably. The gravity of my actions weighed heavily on me as he left me sobbing in the living room. Returning with a glass of water, his unexpected gesture caught me off guard. Clutched in his hand was an envelope, a harbinger of the inevitable. He informed me that he had prepared divorce papers after witnessing my encounter with Jay in the parking lot. While I wasn't ready for this finality, he was, and reluctantly, I accepted the envelope. As I began to read the divorce papers, a sinking feeling gripped me. It became apparent that he was seeking full custody of our son. Shocked, I protested, telling him he couldn't take our son away from me. His response, however, emphasized that it was in our son's best interest to stay with him. Desperation filled me as I refused to sign, adamant that I couldn't bear losing my child. My husband remained resolute, brushing aside my pleas. He asserted that I had 2 days to sign the papers. Disturbingly, he added a menacing condition. I had to end everything with Jay immediately, or he would expose pictures of me with Jay to our son. The threat of tarnishing my son's perception of me left me in a state of shock. Unable to determine if my husband was bluffing, I couldn't risk traumatizing my son further. Alone in the living room, I called Jay, delivering the news and ending our involvement. Jay, understanding the gravity of the situation, offered support and urged me to reach out if needed. Grateful for his understanding, I then contacted my lawyer, detailing the custody terms. The lawyer affirmed my right to refuse such terms and fight for full custody, but the mention of my husband's ultimatum left me paralyzed. Facing an agonizing choice, I grappled with the options. Either I refused to sign and my son would learn about my affair, potentially leading to his resentment, or I signed, letting him stay with his father. Choosing the latter, I signed the papers, accepting the heart-wrenching reality of being distanced from my son. My husband, satisfied with my compliance, granted me a week to explain the impending changes to our son, leaving me with the daunting task of preparing him for a future without me. The revelation that I had to leave my home, and most importantly, my son, was a consequence of my actions that I hadn't fully anticipated. I always knew my affair would lead to repercussions, but losing my son was a devastation I wasn't prepared for. The decision to not seek a divorce earlier was primarily because of him, and now, ironically, I found myself having to leave him behind. Breaking the news to my son that I was moving out was excruciatingly painful. The first time I told him, his tears mirrored my own internal agony. Each moment spent with him during that final week was precious, filled with an acute sense of loss. When the day arrived to drop him off at school for the last time, his renewed tears and my reassurances felt hollow, even though I meant every word. Throughout the week, my husband observed my interactions with our son, but it didn't change anything. I had hoped, perhaps naively, that my evident misery might soften his stance, but it was not to be. He remained detached, a clear indication that his emotions towards me had irrevocably changed. As I prepared to leave our home for the last time, my husband's demeanor was emotionless. He informed me that he had filed for divorce and that his lawyers would be in contact. I could only muster a nod in response, taking a moment to express my regret for everything and to remind him to take good care of our son. His assurance that our son would be well looked after was the only small comfort in that moment. Now, over a month has passed since that day. I've moved into an apartment provided by my company, not having the will to search for anything else. The divorce, being uncontested, is progressing swiftly. My interactions with my son have been limited to 3 phone calls, each a reminder of the deep ache in my heart. Despite the pain, knowing that my son is in good hands with his father, who has always been a devoted parent, provides some solace. My son shared how his father now returns home early to spend time with him, a bittersweet revelation that things might have been different if such changes had occurred sooner. In this solitude, my focus has shifted entirely to work. There has been no contact with Jay since that last call, and I am thankful for the silence. The regret of my affair weighs heavily on me, constantly reminding me of the life I could have had if only I had resisted the temptation. 2 months since leaving, the divorce is finalized. When presented with the option to claim any assets, I declined. The only thing I ever wanted was my son, and knowing I can't have that, nothing else holds value to me. Recently, my son mentioned seeing our former nanny Beth emerging from his father's room in the morning. This revelation was a shock, stirring a mix of emotions. The finality of our divorce and these recent developments mark the end of a chapter and the beginning of a new, uncertain future for all of us. As time passed, the complexities of my failed marriage and the aftermath of my affair continued to unfold. The realization that my ex-husband had moved on and was now engaged to Beth, our former nanny, brought forth a mix of emotions. I couldn't help but question the ease with which he seemingly transitioned into a new relationship, but I quickly reminded myself that I had no right to pass judgment, given my own transgressions. A twinge of sadness lingered as I pondered the speed at which he had moved forward. Despite being the one who initiated the affair that led to the end of our marriage, it still stung to witness him building a life with someone else. However, the guilt and regret of my actions restrained me from expressing any resentment. When my son mentioned seeing Beth in his father's room, I opted for a more considerate approach. Instead of using the situation to my advantage or playing with my son's emotions as my ex-husband had done, I chose transparency. I explained the possibility that Beth might have forgotten something and had returned to retrieve it from his father. I aimed to shield my son from unnecessary emotional turmoil, refusing to manipulate his feelings for my own agenda. Maintaining open communication with my son became my solace. Even though the time I spent with him was limited, every detail he shared became a cherished moment. His smiles during drop-offs brought a peculiar mix of relief and heartache, a relief that he was no longer crying for me, yet a heartache stemming from the uncertainty of whether he missed me. A year after my initial update, my son turned 6. His adaptation to the changes seemed remarkable, and he had grown accustomed to the new dynamics. The pain of my absence had lessened, replaced by a simple smile when I dropped him off. The bittersweet reality lingered, a smile that brought both reassurance and a tinge of melancholy. The most challenging encounter occurred when I learned about my ex-husband's engagement with Beth. Witnessing them together, especially in the house we had once built, stirred conflicting emotions. The intimate kiss they shared served as a stark contrast to the lack of such affection during the final days of our marriage. A forced smile masked my inner turmoil as I acknowledged their impending marriage. The realization dawned that he might be relishing a sense of revenge for my infidelity. Despite the complexities and pain, I left with a kiss on my son's cheeks, embracing the role of a supportive mother. As I reflect on this tumultuous journey, I extend gratitude to those who offered support and empathy, even though our paths may never cross in person. The understanding from others has been a source of strength in navigating the aftermath of my choices.